This is the world's smallest 4K Micro Four Thirds camera. Coming in at only 3 by 2 by 2 inches and weighing less than some smartphones, the Zcam E1 can record 4K DCI log video. Now those specs sound pretty great on paper, but there's definitely a reason that you've probably never heard of this camera. So you may or may not know, I'm a pretty big fan of the company Zcam. Right here I have my Zcam S6 that I use for a lot of professional work, but that's not what we're talking about today. In this video we're talking about this right here, the Zcam E1. I think this is the first camera that Zcam released, and it came out in 2016. So first of all, this thing opens up really weird. Like there's really no way to open this without stuff falling out, but this is what you get with the Zcam E1. So of course you have the power cable right here, so you can run this from the wall with this wall plug to DC converter here. You have a few different plug choices depending on what country you live in. So it's a pretty neat, like kind of customizable power brick you have here. So you basically grab whatever plug is what you use in your country, and you just twist it on there and it works. So that's pretty neat. I've never seen that before. I've seen like converters, but nothing that's like totally customizable like this. Is kind of neat. But either way, the next up is the actual Zcam E1. And this is it right here. This is how big this camera is. Now right off the bat, you can probably see it pretty much looks like a GoPro or like an action camera. And so I've been using this camera for a few weeks now. I got some footage with it. I've been messing around with it, testing all the different settings and everything like that. And I definitely have some interesting opinions about it. But before we get into that, I want to read off some of the specs of this and talk about just some of the pros and cons of this camera. And then I'll kind of give my opinion on this and talk about what I think it would be best used for. So first of all, the Zcam E1, I believe when it first came out, it started at $700. Even considering the specs of it, $700 for this is definitely a high price. I'm not saying it's not worth it, but luckily they dropped the price and now it's $400 new. And you can even pick these up used on eBay for around $300. And it has a magnesium alloy body with what seems to be like a rubber outer coating to it. But this isn't waterproof like most action cameras are. This doesn't have any sort of water resistance rating or anything. I wouldn't bring this in any sort of wet conditions. Now when it comes to the video specs and capabilities of this, it can record up to 4K Cinema DCI video at 24 frames a second. But this can also record 16:9 Ultra HD 4K at up to 30 frames a second, and then 1080p up to 60 frames a second, and 720p at up to 240 frames a second. Now paired along with the 4K video, this can record in Z-Log 2. And so this is Zcam's version of a log profile, which is essentially a flat color profile, which allows you to have a lot of color grading potential while you're editing. It increases dynamic range, and it's essentially the professional color profile. However, one of the downsides of this is I really would not recommend using Z-Log in this camera. I'm gonna get more into that later, but Z-Log is kind of one of those little quirks that they added to say it has it, but it just really isn't a good idea. So when it comes to the rest of the features of this camera, it has a microphone input jack, it has DC 5V input so you can run off an external battery bank. This camera uses micro SD cards, so those are the cards that are like super tiny. It has a Micro Four Thirds mount and a Micro Four Thirds sensor. It also has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, so you can connect to Zcam's app on your phone, and essentially have a wireless video feed. You can change the settings wirelessly. I believe you can change focus wirelessly and a bunch of stuff like that, which is super useful because of how small the screen is on this. It can shoot 16 megapixel RAW photos up to 15 frames a second. It has single and continuous autofocus. And then of course this camera is super tiny. It's 3 by 2.2 by 2 inches and it weighs 7.7 ounces. And so compared with Sony NEX C3, this is, I believe, one of the smallest Sony NEX cameras you can get, and it's still like almost twice the width of the Zcam. And so basically at this point, everything I've said about this camera makes it sound amazing. I mean, it's the world's smallest Micro Four Thirds camera. It has a Micro Four Thirds sensor. I think it's the same one as the GH4, which is an amazing camera. It can record 16 megapixel photos in RAW at up to 15 frames a second. And again, at this small of a size, it sounds amazing. However, I think you know where I'm going with this. So I'm gonna read off the list of different quirks that I came up with while I was testing this camera out. Now I wanna say before I read this list, these are all just things I noticed in general. A lot of these are quirks that pretty much any camera this size or of this nature are gonna have, but I just wanted to mention all the different quirks of it so that if you're planning on buying this, you fully understand the downfalls of this camera before you decide to purchase it. So first of all, this camera gets very hot. It's never overheated on me and shut down or anything like that, but it does get very hot. Also, the footage is definitely pretty noisy at any ISO, especially anything above 100. Also, it only records in an 8-bit 420 codec. And so this kind of leads to some of the downfalls of shooting in log, because it's not a very color-rich, strong codec at only 60 megabits a second. And so with my testing, putting just a simple LUT on it, just by doing that and not changing anything else, it already starts to just tear down the footage and degrade the footage. I noticed like color blocking and chunks and like green and magenta noise all over the place, and it looked really, really bad. I wouldn't recommend ever shooting in log with this. I think in almost any scenario, log is not going to look good. However, on the bright side, the Rec 709 color profile still looks really good with this camera. Also, this camera literally only has one mounting point. It has a 1/4-20 screw on the bottom. There's no hot shoe or cold shoe. There's no other mounting points anywhere on this camera. Also, the screen is pretty small, which makes sense, but it's also very low resolution. So it's a 2.5-inch screen with a 320 by 240 resolution. And this makes it very hard to pull focus. You know, not even the fact that it's such a small screen, it's mostly just because of how low the resolution is. Also, I noticed the mount is a little bit loose. With any lens and lens adapter that I've used, they've wobbled quite a bit, and when I'm focusing, it actually like shifts the image. It's kind of weird. I can't confirm if it's just my unit or if it's all the Zcam E1s, but the Micro Four Thirds mount is just a little bit loose with all the lenses I've used. Another thing is this camera has pretty bad rolling shutter. A lot of people might mount this to a helmet or to a body or to a car or something like that, and in those situations, the rolling shutter is going to be a lot more noticeable than in any sort of like regular filmmaking scenarios. And then last but not least on my list of cons of this camera is it has an audio input jack, but there's no audio gain controls. And so you can't change how loud or how quiet the microphone is. It does it all automatically, and it's just not very useful for getting really good quality audio. Now, most of the downsides of this camera I think could easily be fixed if Zcam made a Mark II or a version 2 of this camera. I think it would be an awesome camera, but this being what it is, you know, Zcam's first camera is kind of their introduction into making cameras. It's definitely not a perfect camera, and it definitely has a lot of quirks that could be deal breakers for a lot of people. Alright, so who would and wouldn't I recommend this camera to? So if you want to get a camera to vlog with, I wouldn't recommend this camera for that. So the reason being is essentially for vlogging, you want a camera you can just pick up and use. You don't have to worry about anything. With this camera, you know, with being an interchangeable lens, it has a larger sensor than a lot of like GoPros and stuff that you'd kind of resemble this with. And so you're gonna have to worry about focus, and this camera doesn't have very good autofocus. And having a, you know, larger than a normal action camera sensor, you're gonna have to worry about keeping the focus correct. It's not just like a single focus thing where you don't have to worry about it. You're gonna definitely need to think about what it's focused on. And being that the autofocus isn't good enough for vlogging, you're gonna have to always manual focus it. And if you turn around to show something, you're going to focus on that. And overall, I think if you want to get into vlogging, I think there's better cameras for that. You can get a point and shoot Canon camera like a G7X, or a point and shoot Sony camera like a ZV-1, or you could even just get a GoPro or, you know, a DJI Osmo Action or something that's similar to this size. And also what I wouldn't recommend this camera for is, you know, being a main filmmaking camera, like an A camera if you want to shoot short films or any sort of filmmaking. I wouldn't recommend this as an A camera. Now, of course, as a B camera or something to put in a car where, you know, your main camera wouldn't fit, or just, you know, an extra camera for filmmaking, I think this would be great for that. Now, I'd also recommend it if you do want to use it as sort of like an action camera, but, you know, where you can put different lenses on it. You can have better quality, maybe a, you know, shallower depth of field, just a more professional looking image. In an action camera scenario, I think this camera would be great for that as well. And then last but not least, this would be a perfect gimbal camera. So let's say you have a larger Micro Four Thirds camera that uses your A camera, but it doesn't quite fit on a, you know, a smaller gimbal. You can use this camera with the same lenses as your other camera and just throw it on a gimbal. It's gonna be very lightweight. You know, it's gonna fit perfectly on any sort of smaller gimbal. And of course, you can still use the same lenses. It's still a Micro Four Thirds sensor, and it still records pretty good 4K DCI video. Now, that being said, you can of course use this camera for anything that you think it'll work for. So like right now, you know, I have it in a vlogging style, I have it on auto ISO, and I'm sure the footage still looks decent. I mean, I'm not saying you can't use it for anything and you have to use it for certain things. You know, if all the specs that I talked about in this video and everything I talked about would fit you perfect for vlogging or for whatever you're doing, you can use this camera for that. You know, it records 4K DCI, good quality video. It has a Micro Four Thirds mount and sensor, so it has decent specs, but there's just some things that would be best used for versus other things. But also, I'm just kind of using this as an excuse for a vlog test, so this is kind of what it looks like handheld. There's no stabilization. This is on a 12mm lens, which is equivalent to about 24mm. Of course, I have a manual focus, so if I turn it around and look at something, it's gonna be out of focus. So, you know, you gotta change the focus. There's no flip out screen. So I kind of have to keep the focus right where it's at and just keep it the same distance away. and just hope it's in focus. But like I said, you can use this camera for anything that you think it'll work for. So watch this entire video, you know, figure out the specs and just see if it'll work for you for what you need to use it for. So without further ado, here's what the Zcam E1 can do. Alright, so that basically wraps this video up. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're interested in seeing a shootout for the best cinema cameras under $500, including this camera, go down, hit the like button, and subscribe. I'm working on that right now. It's going to be an awesome video. So like I said, stay tuned for that. But that wraps this video up. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.